All right, so thus far in this course, we've talked about the basics. What is art? What is creativity? How is art made? Why is art made? And how is art judged? Today, we're going to actually start discussing the different mediums used in making art one by one. We're starting off with the most basic of them all, which is drawing. In case you need a definition of drawing, it's the idea of, I think it's on this next slide, maybe not. Maybe I take it off because I thought it was stupid. The actual definition is pushing or pulling an object on a flat surface, leaving a mark. Literally anyone can draw, a child can draw, so that's why we consider it the most basic form. It's extremely accessible as far as getting the materials to do it, as well as relatively inexpensive. And it is usually where an artwork begins. It's not normal for the end result of an artwork to be a drawing. Most times drawings act as blueprints or sketches for a bigger plan. We're going to be looking at quite a few different examples of those. But one example of an artwork that actually is a drawing that was the end product is Henry Moore's shelter drawings. Henry Moore used drawing during World War II as a means of recording things because the medium is so easily portable. You can literally carry it in your back pocket. It made it easy for him to record what he was seeing, specifically in the underground shelters during the bomb raids. You can't really take like a canvas paints in there with you. You're kind of moving pretty quickly when you're going to a bomb shelter. So for his example of drawing, it is the end product. There wasn't like a painting done afterwards or anything. But it does show the importance of drawing as well as how easy it is as far as using that particular medium and taking it with you where you go. So in the bomb shelters, you couldn't really take cameras because, yeah, once again, kind of moving quickly. Cameras back then were a little bit bulkier than they are today, a lot bulkier than they are today. And there wasn't too much light down in those shelters. Here is the end drawing of that shelter. And technically, this isn't a real, well, it's a bomb shelter, but it's the underground tube station. Londoners were encouraged not to go to the underground tube station for bomb shelters because they weren't properly protected. But sometimes that was the closest area for them to get to quickly. So people would seek shelter in the tube station, which if you're wondering what the tube station is, this is the train station. They would stay there for days sometimes while the bombing was occurring in London. So here we see on a small piece of paper, he has sketched out people that were seeking shelter in those stations, which that is disgusting, by the way. I don't know if you've ever been to like a subway station, but there's like, it's not a clean place. I wouldn't want to be laying on the ground, but I guess it's better than being outside with bombs. To do this, he used pencil, wax crayon, colored crayon, as well as some watercolor and wash and pen and ink, which were added later. But the original sketch that he did while he was there was pencil, wax crayon, and colored crayon. So like I said, literally anyone can draw, which is why it's considered the most basic of all mediums. Oh, there's our definition of drawing in case you needed it. You don't really need it unless you think you need it. And like I was mentioning earlier, oftentimes artists will use drawings as a means of sketching out ideas or recording things quickly. Sometimes the sketches are really drawn out and detailed. Sometimes they're really, really rapid and fast. Da Vinci's facial proportions of a man in profile is an example of one that is quite detailed, and it was used for a later painting. So this is an early study for him to just understand the proportions of a man's face properly. I'm actually going to blow this up really large here so you can get the detail. You might notice there's little lines here in the shape of cubes. Oftentimes when artists are trying to get measurements correctly, they'll make a little grid diagram, and they'll use a ruler or a measurement tool to figure out what should be in what square as they're drawing, so they get everything proportionally correct as far as ratios. And it's a really fun, easy way to get a pretty accurate drawing. I've done it before and it turned out really well, and I'm not a good drawer. So if I can do it, you can do it. But it's just the idea of usually you'll start off with like a 1x1 cube. He was probably doing centimeter cubes. And then you can get another image, like a photograph, and put the same cubes on that one. So that way you just have to focus on that little 1x1 section instead of the whole thing. And it kind of helps to narrow down what you have to accomplish for that particular section. Another example of an artist that uses sketchbooks, but not someone that's known for two-dimensional works, but more movies, is Guillermo del Toro. He often will sketch out ideas before he creates movies. In fact, he sketched out all of the character designs for Pan's Labyrinth, that particular movie, in a sketchbook, which you can see here, detailing all of the dimensions, what they should look like, their characteristics, quite specific as far as everything. Has anyone seen that movie? Okay, just us. You should watch it. It's in Spanish, right? Yeah, I'm like, I think that one's the one that's all in Spanish. But yeah, I would recommend it because evidently the person that wrote your book really, really likes Pan's Labyrinth because they mention it like 3 or 4 times. So you should watch it. But like I was saying, sometimes they'll do it for sketchbooks. Other times they'll be like Da Vinci and try to capture the appearance of something that they're looking at, like the man, the profile of the man that he was looking at. Sometimes it's a projective drawing, so a drawing that they do in preparation for a larger work, which is exactly what this one and this one are. They're both projective drawings. Another example of a projective drawing is Untitled backtrack. I gotta correct myself because I told you the wrong thing. I am so sorry. Projective drawings are drawing things that only exist in your brain. So these characters are characters that only exist in Guillermo del Toro's mind. Untitled number 111 is something that only existed in Martin Ramirez's brain, which, by the way, his drawings are really, really collectible all of a sudden. It's like just this last year. And now everyone's wanting to buy them up, which is weird. I don't know. He'd never really been super prevalent in the art world, and all of a sudden, the last few months, now everyone's wanting to collect them. But hey, whatever. So in that drawing, it is an image of a train passing through an impossible tunnel that he has come up with in his brain. Almost all of his works look the same, with all of the overlapping semicircles or ovals and a lot of lines. It's supposed to be kind of a way to trick your brain into looking at the object a little bit longer to figure out what exactly it's supposed to be, as well as confuse your eye a little bit. So there's our train, and our train ends up turning extraordinarily flat as it is coming around that corner, and it is about to enter the other tunnel. So some artists are really, really good drawers right from the get-go. Others are not, and they have to practice a lot. Just like anything you do in life, the more you do it, the better you get at it. A lot of artists, such as Van Gogh, feel like in order to move on to a different medium, they have to be proficient in drawing first, since it is the most basic one. So they'll practice drawing as much as possible until they feel like they've achieved a level good enough to finally graduate onto whatever other medium they're wanting to work on. For Van Gogh, that medium was painting. Cezanne was a pretty bad drawer at first. So was Van Gogh. This is one of Van Gogh's earlier drawings. You can see that this man, his proportions are not correct. His head is a little bit too large. He's very flat. Really, really large, oversized hands. This one, it looks like an ape's hand. Not really human hands, and the feet kind of disappear into the floor. This particular drawing was done around 1880, and just in 2 years' time, Van Gogh ends up advancing his drawings to this level. So proportionally correct, no longer flat. That takes a lot of practice. You have to be drawing almost every single day to end up getting it from here to here. We'll look at some other examples in a second of really poor drawings too, just to show that anyone can draw. You don't have to be good at it, but you have to have the determination to get better. So as I was saying, Van Gogh felt like he had to master drawing before he could move on to painting, which is what he's really known for, is his paintings that use the loose brush strokes and impasto technique. He clearly struggled with drawing towards the beginning, but of course later on was able to master it and achieve the accuracy that he was trying to achieve. All of the drawings that the two that we looked at are drawings from life. So copying things that actually exist in the real world, particularly people. And as you noticed, he did very simple drawings, pared down, basic, not overly complex. And that's something that he carries over into his paintings as well. He was very fond of Japanese prints, which we'll be talking about next week. But they're very plain, basic, quite flat even. And he would copy that with his paintings as well. And we're going to look at some of his paintings next week too, that were inspired by some of those Japanese prints. Of course, there's Van Gogh's self-portrait, in case you're trying to remember who he is. He's the dude that cut off his ear. You didn't know? No. He was an interesting fellow that probably had a few mental illnesses, but back then in the 1800s, mental illnesses were not quite well known and studied. He did end up in a mental asylum towards the end of his life. In fact, Starry Night was painted out of his room in the mental asylum. But he fell in love with a woman who kind of already was with a guy, and he wanted to profess his love for her, so he cut off his ear and sent it to her. Yeah, Also extraordinarily depressed, tried to kill himself a few times. So interesting fellow. There's a lot of those characters in art history that we'll be looking at. So yeah. But here is kind of one of his drawings that is very, very much inspired by those Japanese prints. I'll actually just pull up a Japanese print so you guys kind of get an idea of what exactly I'm talking about. Because if you don't know, you don't know. So this is Hokusai's Great Wave. That one's really famous. Almost everyone knows that. So very flat. Prints are a different medium altogether that we're going to be covering on Tuesday next week. But very, very flat. And Van Gogh was very much inspired by those prints. A lot of the prints are of landscapes, and a lot of the prints will include things like trees in the foreground blocking the view of the background, which is what we see here as well. This is a drawing. It is pen and ink. So not only pencil is used for drawing, sometimes you can use ink for drawing. We're going to go over all of the different things you can use to draw in a second. But drawing itself serves three functions. I've already mentioned those. Notation, such as making notes, sketching something, and recording something that you see or want to remember, or something that you imagine. So notation being the first example of reasons why you might draw, basically to record something, whether in your brain or something that you saw. The second purpose of drawing is to study in preparation for a larger work, such as a painting. And the third reason for drawing is to that be the end result, to draw to make a piece of art that is a drawing. One example of drawing that was done as a study is the reclining male nude, which was later on used for Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So here's that study. Michelangelo did extraordinarily detailed drawings for preliminary sketches. That's what we call something, if you're using it for like a larger work, it's called a preliminary sketch. So if I use that word again, you know what I'm talking about. So very careful drawing from observation. He looked, once again, for those of you who don't know, you would take a figure drawing class if you were in drawing, in which they would have naked people, and you'd practice drawing them so that you get the human figure correct and proportions correct. So for this study, Michelangelo probably would have paid someone to pose so that he could practice. So he really was drawing a naked dude. We even do figure study here at Maitland College. I think that one's a night class. But yeah, and they hire models. So I mean, if you want a job, if you're comfortable with that, I hear it pays pretty well. But yeah. Another example of a sketch done for a larger work is Picasso's Guernica. Guernica is considered Picasso's masterpiece. It's a really, really large painting that would take up probably, it's bigger than this whiteboard, so it's really a large painting. His early sketch is not detailed. It's just lines. It's a very sad sketch. It looks like a 2-year-old did it. And then of course he did a later sketch which has a lot more detail to try and come up with the composition that he wanted. He changed some things from this composition, and then of course here's the end work, which is an extremely large and extremely important painting, which we'll be talking about later in art history section. Another example of a preliminary sketch is a cartoon. Cartoon is a vocab word. You should probably jot that one down because it pops up a few times again. Cartoons, most people think of those as like animated TV shows, but in the art world, they have a totally different meaning. A cartoon is a preliminary sketch done for a fresco, mosaic, or a tapestry. We'll talk about why in a second. So does anyone know what a mosaic is? Or what it's made of? Yeah, like glass tiles. So we're talking about a large work made of glass tiles that would be on a wall. More often, you see them in like backsplashes in kitchens today. But people will create really intricate designs with them, and there's some examples in art history that we don't get to talk about in this class where they actually illustrate stories with these little tiles. But with mosaics, when you're sticking them to the wall, you're sticking them to grout and tile adhesive. What do you have to do if you realize you messed up? How do you think you get those tiles off to fix it? Yeah, and you're possibly going to mess up the wall, have to start over again. It's not good. Frescoes are wall paintings in which you paint on the plaster. If you mess up on a fresco, you have to jackhammer the plaster off. It's not good. Tapestries, if you're weaving a tapestry and you realize that you messed up, you have to unweave the tapestry until you get to the part you can fix. So cartoons are drawings done in the actual size of whatever that work is going to be. So let's say I was going to paint a fresco on this board. I would make a cartoon drawing that's the same size as this board and sit it in front of me while I'm working. And I'm probably going to section it off in squares so I know which square is which, same with the wall. That way I'll be less likely to mess up and have to jackhammer a part of the wall off. So cartoons serve the purpose as a guide for artists to hopefully not mess up when they're doing the actual thing, because those particular mediums are not ones that you want to mess up on. Tapestries are a little bit different as far as cartoons, because when you're weaving a tapestry, it's a reverse image. When you're weaving, it's on the back side. So those cartoons have to be reverse images, like a mirror image, so that when you do the tapestry, it's correct. Also, funny enough, we talk about one tapestry in this class, and it's done by Raphael. Raphael himself did not weave the tapestry. He just drew the cartoon. And then he sent the cartoon off to weavers. Weaving was considered a women's job. So men would not make tapestries. So yeah, the famous Raphael tapestries that hang in the Vatican are not made by Raphael. Well, I mean, he designed it, but that's it. Now we're moving on from reasons why artists draw to how they draw. Of course, lines are very important with drawing. You have your basic line. I don't know if I need to turn on line. Then you have hatching, which is parallel lines next to each other. And then you have cross-hatching, which is putting lines on top of each other. And the more directions you go, eventually, if this wasn't an expo marker, you would have a really dark part is how you get shading in drawings is by using cross-hatching. Of course, the darker you want that area, the more cross-hatching you're going to have to do. And then contour hatching is, instead of parallel lines next to each other, curved lines next to each other. So you try and get the illusion of a curve in your image. So, fun stuff. If you ever take a drawing class, that's the first thing you're going to do is practice those things, which is going to get very annoying probably because they'll most likely make you practice it. And just this, not drawing anything at all, just practicing cross hatching and contour hatching on a piece of paper for like a couple hours, it'll get old. And of course, with drawing, you have a certain type of paper that you are supposed to use. If you ever go to Hobby Lobby or Michael's and go down the paper aisle, you'll know there's a ton of different kinds of papers. There's a paper that you're supposed to use for watercolors. There's a paper that you're supposed to use for acrylic paint. There's a paper for drawing. There's a paper for charcoal. There's a paper for ink. There's tons of different kinds of paper. And every paper has a different kind of grain, texture, or tooth to it. Paper with a charcoal pencil, which is what we're mostly talking about today, should have an extremely smooth texture. Watercolor paper has a rough, thick texture to it because it needs to hold that paint. Now, if you're using charcoal, you're going to want something with a rougher grain. Charcoal is a particular medium that you like to showcase texture. We're going to look at some charcoal later today. But with charcoal, the main reason why anyone would want to use it to draw with is because it has a lot of texture and grit to it. So you'd want a rougher paper with it to showcase that texture properly. If you chose like printer paper, it wouldn't show that roughness that the charcoal can give you. But printer paper works great for a regular pencil. Now, different things you can draw with. A pencil, a stick of charcoal. They also have reeds of charcoal. If you're wondering what charcoal is, it's literally burnt branches that have been pressed really hard into a stick. But you can buy just the reeds, which is the burnt branches. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's nicer. Because it's not quite as compact, you can get a lot darker color with it than the stick version, but the stick version is a lot less messy. Because it's burnt branches, and it's literally ash, it's ash. It's messy to use and it stains, and you do have to seal it after you're done with some sort of a sealant. Fun fact though, you can use Stronghold hairspray. They don't tell you that in school, but you can use Stronghold hairspray. And of course, pastels are another thing that you can draw with. There's chalk and oil pastels. Chalk pastels are basically sidewalk chalk, just with a little bit more pigment to them. And oil pastels are, of course, an oil-based pastel. You can also use wax crayons like Crayola crayons, but we don't call them Crayolas in art because they get very offended when you say Crayola. But it's wax crayon. And then, of course, ink and brush. That's when you get a pot of ink. They sell it in little jars. You get a brush. And you're basically painting slash drawing with ink that was adopted by the Chinese and it spread throughout Asia, and now it's pretty popular throughout the world. You can also use pen and ink. These kinds of pens are the quill pens. With quills, it's a little got a little mouth on it, and you dip it in a jar of ink and it will hold the ink while you draw with it. making it an extremely dark, opaque line. I forgot to mention with brush, if you want your ink to not be a solid black, you can add water to it to make it a lighter gray. They also make colors in ink like brown and green. So sometimes artists will use those. Here is an example of a thick quill tip for a pen, and they also make really thin ones depending on what size line you're wanting. And then of course a regular pen that everyone knows about. Pencils also come in different sizes depending on how dark you want your line. Your number 2 pencil is right in the middle. They also will make thinner pencils. What I mean by thinner is they decrease the lead width in the pencil, making it like, you know, you got like your 0.7 lead for your mechanical pencils, and it'll go down to like 0.5, which is really, really thin. They do that just inside of wood. They can also go up in size to something called a 9B, which will make a solid black line with graphite, which is kind of cool. It's very, very soft, and it has a very thick lead inside of it. Most artists will not start off with a solid black. They'll start off in a lighter tone, because if you start off really, really dark, it's hard to fix it if you want to change something. So you'll start off normally with your number 2 pencil and then work to a darker tone as needed to shade with. And of course, here's your more clear examples of hatching, cross hatching, and contour hatching. And here is an example of an artist who made use of all 3 of those in these dark areas. Charles White used cross hatching. You can kind of see it breaking out here. I'll make this a little bit bigger for my people in the back. You can see really loose cross hatching up here. There's contour hatching that's been used on the shoulders as well as his face. And of course, basic hatching you can see right here in his fingertips. Yeah. An artist that has made use of all of the shading methods in order to achieve a very realistic looking drawing. That's the main purpose for all of those, is to try and give you some depth and 3-dimensionality in a drawing. Because without shading, it would just look like lines. It would be very flat. So now we're going to get into the different media used in the medium of drawing. Starting with the dry ones, we have charcoal, Conte crayon, which is wax crayon, and pastel. They all have, of course, pencils too. They have varying degrees of hardness. Pencils are quite hard, whereas charcoal is very, very soft. Wax crayons are harder than pastels. Pastels are quite soft. If you were taking a drawing course, you would be practicing with all of these. You'd probably end up gravitating towards one or the other. Usually someone that likes ink will probably hate charcoal. Someone that likes charcoal will probably hate ink. Just depending on your person. And you would learn when to use which medium as well, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Like I mentioned earlier, the softer the material is, the darker your lines are going to be. So I mentioned that reed charcoal is extremely soft, so it's very dark in comparison to literally any of these others. Charcoal is the darkest. It's the softest. Your order of hardest to softest, pencils are the hardest, followed by your Conte crayon or wax crayon, then pastel, and then charcoal. So now we're going to look at some examples of artists that used those particular dry media, starting with charcoal. Like I mentioned earlier, charcoal is literally ashes, so you do have to bind them to the surface with some sort of a fixative. Today they come in spray cans. You used to have to like paint on top of the drawing to fix it, but now you can spray it and it'll fix it. Which, like I said, that's why you can just use really hard hairspray and it won't smudge. But charcoal, being made of ash, does smudge very easily. If you use charcoal, you'll end up covered in it. So yeah, be prepared for that. And you can achieve a wide range of values. Like I mentioned earlier, you can get a really rough texture with charcoal, especially if you use a rough piece of paper with it. And you can also get really, really light shades of gray as well as dense, dark blacks with charcoal, depending on how hard you're pressing. Here is Clemens Webb done with charcoal. This is a reverse image. So she left out the white parts and the gray parts are the charcoal. Charcoal is not something that you can erase once it goes on. In fact, out of all of the mediums that fall under drawing, the only one that you can actually erase is pencil. You can kind of, if you go too dark with charcoal and you haven't set it yet, you can kind of like blot it off a little bit. But it does smudge really easily, so you gotta take your time. And that takes us to Conte crown or wax crown. It's Crayola. They just gotta give it a fancy name to confuse people. But yeah, so we're gonna look at George Seurat's L'Echo, done in Conte crown, which once again is just Crayola. So even with a wax crown, you can achieve a lot of depth, dimension, and gradient as far as ranges from gray to black with enough practice. And then that takes us to pastels. I mentioned earlier there were chalk and oil pastels. Your chalk pastels, basically sidewalk chalk. With oil pastels, you can get a lot of smooth color textures. In fact, oil pastels, this is going to be our first colored image. So you can see a very soft quality that you can achieve with that particular medium. There's not the rough texture with the wax crown or the charcoal. It is very soft. And then that takes us to liquid media, which is ink. There's ink and brush and ink and pen. We're mostly going to be looking at black and, well, we are only looking at black and brown inks today. The invention of colored inks is relatively new to society, which might be mind-boggling to people that write in colored pens every day. But as far as keeping it in a jar and using it for art, that's pretty new for artists. If you're using washes of ink, that just means that you thinned out that ink with water to get a lighter shade. And then, of course, like I mentioned earlier, you can use regular pens as well as markers fall under this category of ink. Literally anything that disperses ink falls under the category of ink. Hokusai's Tuning the Samisen is a ink painting. It was done with a brush and washes of ink. So you see the darker areas of solid black, and then some lighter areas where he's most likely lightened the black ink a little bit by adding some water. can also make it extraordinarily light to get a really, really light gray color. We looked at one of those when we were looking at atmospheric perspective, an ink drawing in which he lightened the black ink quite a bit to get the far mountain. Some more examples of liquid media. Like I mentioned, though, this idea of using ink came from the East, which is why we started off looking at Hokusai, a Japanese artist. And now we're going to look at some non-Eastern examples of how they've implemented this medium of ink, starting with Rembrandt van Rijn. Once again, you can see some lighter and darker areas with the ink. And he has also used gouache. We're going to talk about gouache on Monday with watercolors, but gouache, it has the texture of whiteout, liquid whiteout, and it's always white. So I always like to think of it as whiteout. That's just been thinned out a little bit with water. So these areas, particularly right here, here, and here, have that gouache applied to them to give them a lighter tone. Here's another one in which the artist used ink and gouache. You can clearly see the gouache on this one, it's the white part. And then, of course, the ink in the background. And of course, drawing is not just used in like high-level artworks by really, really famous artists, but it's also used in everyday life with things like comics. Comics themselves are an art form of drawing, in which the artists will illustrate the stories for us visually as we read along. And the idea of comics have been around for a really, really long time. They began with the lovely little hieroglyphic stories of the ancient Egyptians and flow through the medieval tapestries into present day. Some examples of comics that implement drawing, well, all comics pretty much use drawing. McKay's Little Nemo in Slumberland from 1906, which was a newspaper comic strip. Hernandez cover of Fear of Comics. And then, of course, comics eventually end up evolving into graphic novels as well, which also implement drawing. Some more. Drawing today has evolved quite a bit into using odd things. In fact, art itself, artists try and push the boundaries as far as like what they can do different. That hasn't been done before. So here we see Christine Hebert and her example of drawing, which doesn't use any of the things that we've talked about today. It used painter's tape. So on the walls in the gallery, she has put painter's tape. But if you remember, our definition of drawing is just making marks on a flat surface. Technically, it counts as a drawing. This also counts as installation art, which you'll learn about later on. And some more examples of how drawing has evolved today. We're going to look at iPad drawings. So digital drawings are quite a new trend. There's tons of different apps and softwares that you can buy and download to draw on devices and practice drawing on devices. And I'm on TikTok and I like to watch the I'm on the art side of TikTok, and right now there's a bunch of people that are downloading things for their iPads to practice drawing. And I'm oh, that looks so cool, but I'd probably get so irritated. So I don't have patience. But it looks really cool. But one of the first artists to make use of those materials is David Hockney. And this is one of the iPad drawings that he did. He did a series of iPad drawings. And we're talking about a dude that's pretty old. So it's kind of interesting that he started doing this because Hockney's been around since the 60s in the art world. So quite impressive that artists from earlier times are still evolving and changing with the technologies being produced today. And of course, if you want to stay relevant in the art scene, you have to do that. You have to constantly change and move with trends. Otherwise, you're just going to fall behind and get forgotten and not make money anymore. So that's it for drawing. Are there any questions about drawing? It's pretty easy to grasp this one. In fact, all of the mediums are pretty easy until we get to printmaking. Printmaking, it's a little complex, but it's not hard. Next week, we are going to move on to painting. It's going to be the same deal. We're going to go over what painting is, why painting is used, and the different kinds of paints throughout history. We're going to go in chronological order for painting, though, instead of just randomly with this one, because painting has evolved quite a bit throughout time as well. There's some paints that we just don't use anymore because they're not practical. And some paints that we do use because they're extremely easy to use. So that's what we're going to do on Monday, and then Tuesday we'll go into printmaking and so on and so forth. Remember, if you haven't taken your test yet, it closes at midnight Friday. So not tonight, but like tomorrow night. I had someone ask me that before. So make sure to get that done. It is open book, open notes. You get 60 minutes. Don't rush it. And remember to write in complete sentences. I think those are the only reasons why people tend to fail it, is because they don't write in complete sentences and they rush towards the end. But yeah. And of course, if you have any questions or need to talk to me, just reach out and I will get back with you as soon as possible. You guys are done and free to go. And have a great weekend. You too. Oh, yeah. Did I forget you? I'm sorry. I woke up with the worst migraine today, and I had to take like really strong medicine for it. So I'm not really here right now. It might be closed. It's like I'm here, but I'm not here. I know. Yeah, most of the medium lectures are pretty short. Because it used to be that we had to do a group project over censorship around this time. They got rid of it finally, which was nice because I hated it. So I would give everyone time in class at the end to work on it, but now we don't have to do that. So we just get done early. You too.